Imagine a world where a cut felt like an invisible blade, where the line between life and death was as thin as the edge of a primitive razor. In this harsh reality, a creature emerged, one that defied everything we thought we knew about evolution, intelligence and instinct. They were not animals, nor were they belated versions of ourselves, certainly not mere accidents of chance. Neanderthals were nature's wild masterpiece, perhaps the most brilliant failure in the history of life on Earth. But why did they vanish so quickly? And did they ever truly vanish? Prepare yourself for a journey where myth collides with reality, where the past whispers uncomfortable truths about who we are and what we may yet become. Even now, a question still echoes through the caves. What if the real Homo sapiens wasn't us? Long before great cities, before ships crossed oceans or planes crisscrossed the skies, the planet was a wild and cruel scene. We are here about 400,000 years ago. The Earth is a changing patchwork. Glaciations alternate with brief periods of heat, shaping an unstable and unpredictable planet. Dense forests wrap around icy plains. The wind howls in the frozen deserts, while elsewhere fertile valleys grow like ephemeral miracles. It was the height of the Ice Age. Temperatures dropped. Suddenly, and the world was inhabited by titans, woolly mammoths, shaggy rhinos, cave bears, and felines with deadly fangs. All of them, giants adapted to resist the cold, the long nights, and the incessant hunger. But the real monster of this world, it was time. With each slow pace of centuries, glaciers advanced like living walls, engulfing entire lands, forcing desperate migrations. Climates that once supported life have become frozen deserts within a few generations, and in this context of absolute risk, every living thing must adapt or die. The Neanderthals were born from this chaos. They emerged in Eurasia, a land brutally shaped by ice, mountains, and biting winds. Europe, Western Asia, and parts of the Middle East became his domains, kingless kingdoms, where only the strongest, most cunning, and most resilient could remain alive. In these vast expanses, coniferous forests stretched as far as the eye could, sea interspersed with icy meadows. The rivers flowed slowly, often covered in thick layers of ice. The seasons were unbalanced, brief, almost non-existent summers, long and deadly winters. The Neanderthal world was a constant war against the planet itself, and not just the climate. The natural environment was an arena for formidable predators. Saber-toothed cats, monstrous hyenas, cave bears twice their size today. Each foray in search of food could be the last. To survive, Neanderthals didn't just need strength, they needed genius. They have become masters of adaptation. They did not have the advantage of modern Homo sapiens. They did not have great civilizations, nor writing, nor agriculture. They had only one instinct, and an intelligence brutally forged by suffering. Imagine living in a world where an error in judgment leads not to a small failure but to death, where every decision, where to hunt, where to shelter, who to trust, was a life sentence or extinction. There was no room for weakness. Their bodies were perfect machines for this environment, sturdy, muscular, short and compact, retaining heat like traveling furnaces. Their broad noses warmed the frigid air before it reached the lungs. His calloused, strong hands manipulated the tools with brutal dexterity. But what really set Neanderthals apart wasn't just their looks, it was in the spirit. And this mind, capable of building, of imagining, of planning, would make them one of the most extraordinary forms of life that the planet has ever known. And paradoxically, it would push them into oblivion. The stage was set. The world was a hostile giant. The Neanderthals, nature's fierce response to the brutality of the Earth. But even the most beautiful works of evolution are fragile in the face of time. What exactly caused the demise of these incredibly adapted creatures? Was it the weather? Was it the arrival of new rivals? Or something darker? It's not yet time to respond. First, we must understand who were these creatures really? And why maybe, just maybe, they were more human than we ever dared to admit. To understand Neanderthals, you first have to look around them. They did not live in isolation. They shared the world with creatures so imposing they would make today's largest animals look like miniatures. And each being, each predator, each prey sculpted the behavior, the habits and the very soul of the Neanderthals, woolly mammoths. They marched across the steppes, almost mythological creatures, covered in thick layers of fur and blubber, enduring temperatures that would freeze any modern human being in minutes. Woolly rhinoceros with their monstrous horns wandered in silent groups like prehistoric battle chariots. Giant hyenas they were waiting, implacable scavengers, organized into terribly efficient bands, cave lions, larger and more ferocious than any lion we know today, hunted in deadly ambushes. The air with every breath carried the smell of fear and blood. But there was much more. Other humans. While Neanderthals dominated Europe and the Middle East, other human species thrived in other places. In Africa, the first Homo sapiens began to take shape, a new lineage with slimmer bodies, restless brains and migratory minds. In Asia, there existed mysterious creatures like the man got up, surviving in isolated pockets, and the enigmatic Denisovans, close relatives of Neanderthals and modern humans, shrouded in secrets that have only recently begun to be discovered in the frozen soil of Siberia. The Earth at that time was a boiling cauldron for humanity. A game of distorted mirrors, where different versions of what we call the human being coexisted, confronting each other, crossing invisible borders, sometimes finding each other, sometimes destroying each other. But among them, the Neanderthals were the masters of the cold. They developed techniques that would leave our modern ancestors reeling. Refined stone tools, specialized hunting weapons, hand-sewn fur clothing, mammoth bone shelters. All of this is shaped not by scientific curiosity, but by the brutal need for survival. And yet, there was more. Contrary to the popular image of mindless brutes, Neanderthals had a culture. Deep in now-forgotten caves, they left red pigments carefully applied to the stone walls, symbols that still defy our understanding today. In their tombs, bodies are found buried with flowers, not accidentally but intentionally, suggesting rituals, respect for the dead, perhaps even beliefs about the afterlife. They not only survived, they felt it. The warm touch of a loved one, the silent mourning of death, the hope of something beyond the daily struggle all throbbed within them. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the more we delve into Neanderthal traits, the less we can see them as other, and the more we are forced to see them as alternative versions of ourselves. They dominated the fire. They knew how to make composite tools, combining wood, stone, and resins to create powerful spears. They hunted in a coordinated manner, in groups that had to trust each other to take on prey dozens of times their size. They lived in small bands, tribes united by blood ties and shared suffering. Every blizzard faced, every animal slaughtered, every child raised against all odds was a silent triumph against extinction. And if, in our modern arrogance, we mock them, perhaps it is because on a deep level we recognize that we could have been them, or even worse, maybe we are what they would have become if they had had enough time. But time was the invisible enemy. As they shaped ice and stone, something new and terrible approached, something fine, agile and voracious, something that not only hunted animals, but also dreams. We modern Homo sapiens began leaving Africa, invading the Neanderthal world like a silent storm. At the beginning, there were meetings, some peaceful, others deadly. And in the midst of all this, a mystery remains to this day. Why, despite all their strength and ingenuity, did Neanderthals begin to disappear? Could the answer lie in the weapons we use, in the illnesses we carry, or something even deeper, scarier? Something we never wanted to admit. Imagine waking up every day knowing that the planet itself wants to kill you. This was life for Neanderthals, and in this brutal landscape, they not only survived, they thrived for more than 300,000 years. A feat that our own species still struggles to match. But how did they do it? Physical strength. It was only part of the equation. Yes, their bodies were strong as steel, thick necks, muscular arms, rib cages as wide as barrels, short and powerful legs, capable of crossing rough terrain without succumbing to the cold. But muscles are not enough to overcome hunger. It does not escape predators either. It also doesn't guarantee that your lineage will survive. What really made the Neanderthals the masters of the frozen world was your practical intelligence, your raw creativity and your deep sense of community. They were born strategists. They hunted with almost military efficiency. They used throwing spears and percussion lances, some so well balanced that they could pierce the thick skin of a rhino with a single blow. They hunted from ambush, knowing the terrain as an extension of their own bodies. They set traps and channeled their prey towards gorges or cliffs. They didn't just respond to nature. They shaped the environment to their advantage, and to face the merciless fury of the elements, they created ingenious shelters, caves fortified with walls of skin and bones, small tents in protected clearings, strategically placed fireplaces to heat the maximum number of people with the minimum amount of fuel. They also mastered fire, not only to cook food, which in itself increases the availability of nutrients, but also to heat, light, protect. Fire was the beating heart of their camps, a symbol of life in a world of darkness, and there was more. Neanderthals developed composite tools, sharp stone blades attached to wooden handles using natural resins and animal sinew as attachments. Each tool is the result of complex logical reasoning, identification of materials, technical tests, correction of defects. They were the first engineers, and contrary to popular belief that they were crude, solitary beings, the social lives of Neanderthals were sophisticated. They cared for the sick and injured, even those who had lost the ability to hunt. This indicates something beyond immediate survival: empathy, emotional connections, sense of collective value. In small bands composed of relatives and close allies, each member was indispensable. The loss of a hunter, a wise elder, and a caring mother was more than a personal tragedy. It was a potentially fatal blow to the entire community. That's why they protected themselves. They fought for every life. And perhaps in these small tribes, in the stories told around campfires, in the invisible bonds between hunters and guardians, the first glimpse of what we today call civilization was born. They taught knowledge of where to hunt, how to light a fire, and how to make a spear was not transmitted solely by blind imitation, but by active communication. And yes, Neanderthals had language. Although direct remains are rare, the structure of their hyoid bones, the same bone that supports human speech, and the complexity of their behaviors suggest that they could articulate sounds, perhaps even words. Imagine the first storytellers recounting heroic hunts under the flickering glow of flames. Imagine the first songs, the first war cries, the first whispers of love. But even the best strategies have their limits. Every winter was a Russian roulette of hunger and cold. Every hunt was a dangerous dance with death. Every migration had to be perfect, because one mistake, a simple mistake, could mean the end of an entire lineage. So, even with all their ingenuity, even with their impeccable adaptation, the Neanderthals unknowingly found themselves engaged in a fight against something that neither they nor their tools nor their fire could defeat. Inevitable change. The world was starting to change. Glaciers advance, then retreat. New competitors have appeared. The old hunting routes have become arid deserts, and in the distance, crossing valleys and rivers, came slender forms, with curious eyes and insatiable thirst. A wise man. They arrived in silent waves, bringing not only new tools but also an overwhelming hunger, not only for food, but also for territory, resources and space. The Neanderthals had conquered nature, but they were about to face a much more unpredictable enemy, another human. The planet, which once seemed to obey the rules that the Neanderthals mastered so well, began to behave treacherous. Ice ages have advanced and retreated with a cyclical violence that no one could have predicted. In a few thousand years, a blink of an eye on the scale of the Earth, vast fields became icy deserts, forests fragmented into isolated patches, and the large herds that supported Neanderthal life became wandering ghosts, difficult to track, impossible to hunt in sufficient numbers. Temperatures dropped and rose sharply. The rivers have changed course, the fertile plains turned into inhospitable swamps. The landscape, so familiar, has become unrecognizable. Imagine building an entire culture on an intimate understanding of the land and suddenly seeing that land transform before your eyes, like sand slipping through your fingers. Neanderthals tried to adapt. They migrated when necessary. They expanded their territories even if it meant facing unknown and hostile groups. They adjusted their hunting strategies. They refined their tools. But there were limits. The scarcity of large prey forced them to look for new sources of food. Small animals, seasonal fruits, bitter roots. His diet, once rich and energetic, began to become unstable and less nutritious. Hunger has become a constant visitor. And when hunger sets in, it devours more than just bodies. It devours hope. And that leads to desperate decisions. There is evidence, but it's still controversial today, that in moments of absolute desperation, some Neanderthals may have resorted to ritual cannibalism, not as a common practice, but as a last cry for survival, a terrible gesture against imminent extinction. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens approached. These new humans were different in ways that were almost imperceptible but devastating in the long run. They seemed to communicate better. They innovated faster. They adapt more easily to changing environments. If Neanderthals were masters of surviving in a static world, sapiens were artists of change, and the shock was inevitable. Homo sapiens brought new technologies, more effective bows and arrows, finely crafted bone tools, large-scale cooperative hunting techniques that surpassed anything Neanderthals had developed. But perhaps more importantly, they brought new ideas about symbols, about art, about large-scale alliances. They built trade networks, even over great distances. They shared information between tribes. It was as if, while Neanderthals struggled to survive in small, isolated groups, sapiens were evolving into a collective species, a vast, interconnected mind. And that made Neanderthals vulnerable in a new and deadly way. Epidemics, diseases that Homo sapiens may have carried without major effects, could have been devastating for Neanderthals, whose bodies had no immunological defense against unknown pathogens. One friendly meeting was enough. Just one handshake, just one touch, and the disease would spread like wildfire, decimating entire families within weeks. The Neanderthals were attacked from all sides. The bitter cold, the constant hunger, the new human predators, the invisible diseases. Each blow in isolation could have been overcome, as they had so many times before. But together in a brutal and incessant sequence, they were simply crushed. In some areas, Neanderthals resisted valiantly, in the forests of Western Europe. In the deep caves of southern Spain, in forgotten pockets of Central Asia, they continued to fight, they continued to love each other. They continued to dream, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire with your bare hands. Each generation was smaller than the previous one, every winter more relentless. Each encounter with the sapiens is more uneven, and then they started disappearing. First from the open plains, after the hills, after the caves. His footprints, as firm and ancient as the stones beneath his feet, began to fade. What remains of them today? Broken bone fragments, tools forgotten in the deep layers of the soil, faded pigments on the walls, of silent caves, and a mystery that still resonates. Have they really disappeared, or perhaps somehow they still live within us? They resisted until their last breath. For thousands of years, even in the face of the impossible, Neanderthals defied fate. But history is relentless, and sometimes even the bravest heroes are defeated not by their own failures, but by the merciless march of time. The end was not an explosive cataclysm. There was no bloody last battle. There was not a single apocalyptic event. The extinction of the Neanderthals was silent. First, their communities began to fragment. Groups that previously cooperated no longer met. Small families found themselves isolated, trapped in smaller and smaller pockets, surrounded by hostile lands that they no longer recognized. Genetic diversity has collapsed. With fewer individuals to reproduce, the devastating effects of inbreeding have appeared. Genetic diseases, infertility, physical fragility. What was once a powerful and resilient bloodline capable of surviving the horrors of the Ice Age, began to break from the inside out. The last generations of Neanderthals were born into a world that was no longer theirs. Large animals had almost disappeared. Hunts have become rare. Hunger has gone from a temporary crisis to a chronic reality, and around them Homo sapiens flourished. While the Neanderthals were putting out their last fires, the sapiens were inventing new instruments, new paints, new ways of living and growing. The contrast was brutal. In caves like Gorham on the coast of Gibraltar, archaeologists have found evidence of some of the last Neanderthals. They fought until the end. They have adapted to fishing and collecting shellfish. Their eating habits and hunting routines have changed. They were desperately trying to move forward, but it was too late. Homo sapiens not only survived, he dominated. They organized large-scale hunts. They domesticated dogs. They built social networks that transcended family boundaries. They were no longer just hunters, they were conquerors. For Neanderthals, the world not only changed, it closed. But what if the ending hadn't been absolute? Today we know that Neanderthals did not completely disappear. They mingled with us. Yes, at one point, in a dark European forest or on the banks of an icy Asian river, a Neanderthal and a Homo sapiens looked at each other not as enemies, but as something more, as partners, like lovers. Today, all modern humans, outside of Africa, carry fragments of Neanderthal DNA in their bodies. 3% of our genetic code is a silent legacy from these ancient souls who refused to disappear without a trace. They live in us, in our hair, in our skin, in our immune system, in the little whims of sleep, in the way our body reacts to the cold, even in the traces of our emotions. The Neanderthals were not defeated, they merged. And this was perhaps his last and most magnificent survival strategy. Not resistance through force, but transcendence through union. But the question persists. What if things had been different? What if they had had enough time to adapt? What if, instead of disappearing into the mists of history, they had walked alongside us until today? What? Would we have built together? Cities of stone and ice? Intertwined myths of two worlds? Societies shaped not by a single humanity, but by two ancient souls living in harmony. The disappearance of the Neanderthals is not just a biological tragedy. It's a story of paths not taken. It's a lingering echo of what could have been, and never was. Thus, in the silence of abandoned caves, in the footprints erased by the rain, in the ancient dust which still floats in our modern lungs, the Neanderthals whisper, not as defeated, not like ghosts, but as part of us, an eternal reminder that the history of humanity is also its history. The story of the Neanderthals is not just a story of extinction, it's a mirror facing us. This shows that brute force is not enough to survive. This intelligence, this courage, and even this love do not guarantee a future. This shows that the world is changing, and those who do not change with it are disappearing. Today, as we face climate change, pandemics, and deep social divisions, the Neanderthal echo resonates louder than ever. Are we ready to change? Or will we too be swept away by forces beyond our understanding? The Neanderthals did not fail. They were a wild masterpiece of nature, intense, brilliant, and fleeting. And now the real question is, what will we learn from them? Because maybe the next chapter of the story is still being written, and this time we are the protagonist.